Hey, seventh grade. As you can see, got a little partner here. This is Jude. Jude, say hi. Can you say hi? Can you say hi to the kids? Yeah. Jude is kind of obsessed with me because when I hold him, I'm way taller than his mom and dad, so he's not used to being up really high up in the air. So I think Jude is like my biggest fan. So I thought that you and I could make a video today about Europe during the Middle Ages. What do you think, Jude? Does that sound good? He's like, yeah, whatever. Okay, yeah. Oh, you look really happy to be here. Okay, so we are learning again about some introductory material to the chapter 15. In the last video, I introduced Magna Carta. We talked a little bit about what that was. I talked a little bit about the Norman invasion of England. I talked about Charlemagne and the Franks. I talked about the dispute between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII and how they reached an agreement in something called the Concordat of Worms. I also talked a little bit about the Crusades. So now we're on slide 4. Okay. So I left off by saying that the Crusades were kind of a disaster, weren't they, Jude? Yes, they were. The Crusades were a big disaster. Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for your contribution. Um, do you remember why the Crusades were a disaster? Do you remember that? Well, we didn't really get into that, so it's okay if you don't remember. But the Crusades were a disaster essentially because they were extremely violent, and the Crusaders were not very popular among the people they were trying to liberate. Now, in the First Crusade, which we'll learn about in a bit, that one was somewhat successful because what it did is it allowed Christendom to show that it was a big force in the world, right? It was a force to be reckoned with. Um, it also allowed Christianity to remove the Muslims from Spain. Now, the Muslims are going to kind of go back and forth in controlling Spain, but after the Crusades, the Muslims basically no longer had control of Spain anymore. The Crusades also were a failure because um, they caused a lot of suffering, right? So a lot of Jews and Muslims were persecuted by the Crusades, and so this made them unwilling to participate or it made the Jews unwilling to participate in helping the Christians with the Crusades. All right, so let's talk about some of the positive effects of the Crusades. So one thing that the Crusade did that was good for Christian Europe, in addition to showing the world that Christian Europe is a force to be reckoned with and is here to stay, the Crusades were good for Christianity in Europe because it dramatically expanded the power of the Pope even more. So the Pope had even more power than he had before. And it also increased trade in the Mediterranean. So it made places like Italy, where Rome and the Pope were residing, very, very wealthy. Right? And after the Middle Ages, Europe is going to enter a period called the Renaissance. And during the Renaissance, Italy is where Europe's wealth and culture is really located. So Italy sort of becomes the center of Europe during the early Renaissance. Okay. So let's talk a minute about Spain here. So when Spain is reconquered and taken back from Muslim forces, um, the government of Spain installs a Christian monarchy, and these Christian kings and queens of Spain, like the other kings and queens of Europe, form strong alliances with the church. Uh, One consequence of this is something called the Spanish Inquisition. So the Spanish Inquisition was a way for the church to get rid of heretics, right? People who are Christians who are promoting false teachings about Christianity. And the church did not want heretics spreading heresies around, did they, Jude? No, they didn't want that at all. And so they instituted the Spanish Inquisition. So the government of Spain worked with the church to create this system for imprisoning and interrogating. Do you want your toy? Imprisoning and interrogating people they suspected of promoting heresies. Right. So there's basically two effects of the Inquisition that I want to bring up now. Number one, the church being involved in the Inquisition allowed the church to help the government to get rid of enemies of the church or enemies of the state. Now, oftentimes, because the state, the government was Christian and had an alliance with the Pope in Rome, enemies of the church and enemies of the state were the same. However, it also caused the church to somewhat limit the power of the government as well. So basically what the Inquisition did is it said, all right, if you arrest someone and you're accusing them of a heresy, which is a crime, right? Spreading a false teaching about Christianity in Spain at this time is a crime. Then what happens is there are rules you have to follow when you imprison and interrogate them, right? You can't just execute them from no reason. You actually have to follow a certain set of rules, right? So basically, contrary to popular opinion, the Inquisition actually limited the use of torture. Oftentimes, when you hear the word Inquisition, people will talk about torture, right? Because they associate it with that. What in reality, the Inquisition said you're only allowed to use torture under very limited circumstances, right? Because what was happening was members of the Spanish government, in order to get information out of prisoners or in order to get prisoners to stop being heretics, the Spanish government wanted to use torture or even execution against not only heretics, but also Jews and Muslims in order to force them to convert to Christianity. And the church and the Inquisition said, nope, you cannot do that, right? Certain forms of torture are not acceptable. So there are actually limits on the amount of torture that you could include. Oh, hello, Holly. Right, so they had rules about how you treat prisoners. Yeah, sure. All right. Say goodbye to Jude. My sister's gonna take him.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem. So yeah, basically, that's what we need to know about the Inquisition. Although I should note that unfortunately, a lot of church officials who are supposed to make sure that torture didn't happen started to ignore the presence of torture. Right, so they would know that torture is going on and they would just ignore it. Right, so that was really bad. Okay. All right, that slide took a while. I just want to make one more quick one about how the Crusades began. So basically, as we know from our study of chapter 2, Muslims controlled Jerusalem after the Roman Empire fell. And at first, Muslim leaders called caliphs were allowing Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem. But in the year 1076, there's a very violent group of Muslims called Seljuk Turks who captured Jerusalem. They took it away from the previous Muslim rulers. There's like a civil war among the Muslims, and the Seljuks won, and the Seljuks were more cruel and violent. And so the Seljuk Turks started to burn down all the Christian churches in the region. They would capture Christian pilgrims and torture them. They also threatened to destroy the Byzantine Christian church and destroy Constantinople. So the Byzantine emperor was really afraid of this, and he asked Pope Urban II to help. Pope Urban II uh, basically offered kings and nobles and knights rewards, financial and otherwise, in order to travel to Jerusalem and fight back against these Seljuk Turks and recapture the Holy Land. Right. Okay. Um, so yeah, we're not going to go into all the different crusades right now. You just need to know some basic effects of the crusades. So we already went over negatives, which would be torture and death and brutal attacks against Christians, non-Christians alike. So Jews, Muslims, and Christians all suffered tremendously during the crusades. Other consequences of the crusades is people who were successful in the crusades became very wealthy and very powerful. Unfortunately, a lot of bad people became very powerful by the Crusades. Right? They would pillage villages and take everything for themselves and become wealthy that way. Um, on the bright side, the Crusades expanded trade and they established connections between Europe and the rest of the world that existed for the rest of time or up until the modern day. Also, interacting with Muslims who are very good in math and science and medicine and art uh, brought a lot of Islamic knowledge into Europe. So it made things like European cathedrals improve, and European medicine improve, and European universities improve. All right, we're stopping there.